Let's begin with a simple truth, one that might change how you think about getting better at anything. Speed comes from focus, not time spent. It's easy to believe that the more hours you put into something, the faster you'll improve. But time alone doesn't create skill. What matters is where your attention goes during those hours. When you're truly focused, fully present with what you're learning, every minute becomes more valuable. It's not about grinding through endless practice sessions. It's about the quality of your attention in each moment. Think of focus like a beam of light. When scattered, it barely illuminates anything. But when concentrated into a single point, it can cut through steel. Your learning works the same way, and this brings us naturally to something closely related. Learning is faster when attention is single-tasked. We live in a world that celebrates multitasking, that makes us feel productive when we're juggling 5 things at once. But our brains don't actually work that way. When you try to learn something while your phone is nearby, while notifications are pinging, while part of your mind is thinking about what's for dinner, you're not learning efficiently. You're fragmenting your cognitive resources. Each time your attention splits, you're essentially starting over. Single tasking feels slower in the moment, but it's exponentially faster over time. When you give one skill, one concept, one practice session your complete attention, your brain can form stronger neural connections. The learning sticks. So if you want to accelerate your progress, the answer isn't to do more things at once. It's to do one thing fully. Now, let's consider something many people overlook entirely. Your environment shapes speed more than willpower. We tend to think that learning is all about internal drive, about pushing through with sheer determination. But the truth is, your surroundings are constantly influencing your ability to learn. A cluttered desk makes focus harder. A noisy room fragments your attention. Poor lighting causes fatigue. The presence of distractions creates friction, and friction slows everything down. When you design an environment that supports learning, when you remove obstacles before you begin, you're no longer fighting an uphill battle. You're allowing your natural capacity to emerge. This isn't about willpower at all. It's about recognizing that you are not separate from your environment. You are part of a system, and when that system is aligned, learning becomes almost effortless. Which leads us to a powerful realization. You don't need motivation, you need systems. Motivation is wonderful when it appears like a strong wind filling your sails, but motivation is fickle. It comes and goes. It abandons you on Tuesday mornings. It disappears when things get difficult. If you rely on motivation alone, your learning will be inconsistent, stop and start, dependent on how you feel. But systems are different. A system is a structure that works whether you feel motivated or not. It's a specific time you practice, a particular sequence you follow, a method that doesn't require enthusiasm to function. Systems remove the need to make decisions. They eliminate the friction of wondering, should I practice today? When you build systems around your learning, you make progress automatic. And automatic progress is the fastest kind there is. Here's something else that might surprise you. Consistency beats intensity for long-term skill growth. There's a certain appeal to the idea of the intense practice session, the weekend where you immerse yourself completely, the 12-hour marathon where you push yourself to exhaustion. And those sessions can feel productive, but they're not the most efficient path to mastery. The research is clear on this. Distributed practice, small, consistent sessions spread over time, creates stronger, more durable learning than cramming everything into intense bursts. This happens because your brain needs time to consolidate what it's learned. Sleep, rest, time away from the skill. These aren't breaks from learning. They're part of the learning process itself. When you practice consistently, even in small doses, you're giving your brain repeated opportunities to strengthen neural pathways. You're building a skill that lasts. And when we talk about consistency, we find that short, frequent sessions beat long marathons. Imagine two people learning a language. One practices for 3 hours every Saturday. The other practices for 25 minutes every single day. Who learns faster? The research consistently shows it's the second person. Those daily sessions, even though they're brief, create momentum. They keep the skill active in your mind. They prevent forgetting between sessions. Long marathons might feel more substantial, but they often include diminishing returns. The third hour of practice is rarely as productive as the first. Short sessions keep you fresh. They end before fatigue sets in. They're easier to maintain, easier to protect in your schedule. And over weeks and months, those small sessions compound into something remarkable. There's a practical tool that can help with this. Time boxing practice increases efficiency. When you set a specific boundary around your practice, when you say, I will work on this for exactly 30 minutes, something interesting happens. You become more focused because you know the time is limited. There's no room for distraction when the clock is ticking. Time boxing also prevents the exhaustion that comes from open-ended practice sessions. Without a clear endpoint, practice can drain you, making it harder to return tomorrow. But when you know exactly when you'll stop, you can give your full energy to the present moment. Time boxing transforms practice from an overwhelming commitment into a manageable container. And that container protects your consistency. Now let's talk about what happens inside your mind during learning. Learning speed declines when cognitive load exceeds working memory. Your working memory is like a mental workspace. It can only hold so much at once. Most research suggests we can actively work with about 4 to 7 pieces of information simultaneously. When you try to learn something that requires juggling more elements than this, everything slows down. You feel overwhelmed. You forget things you just learned. Progress stalls. This is why breaking complex skills into smaller components is so effective. It's not just about organization, it's about respecting the limitations of your cognitive architecture. When you reduce what you're trying to hold in mind at any given moment, you work within your capacity instead of exceeding it. And within that capacity, learning flows smoothly. Related to this is another principle. Learning speed increases when irrelevant information is removed. We often assume that more information is always better, that comprehensive knowledge is the goal. But when you're learning a skill, not all information is equally useful. Some of it is essential. Some of it is merely interesting. And some of it actively interferes with your progress. The fastest learners are ruthless about elimination. They identify the core elements that matter most and focus exclusively on those, at least in the beginning. This isn't about being shallow, it's about being strategic. Every piece of irrelevant information you process is consuming cognitive resources that could be used for what actually matters. Simplify first. Add complexity later. This is the path to speed. And finally, here's something truly liberating. Mastery is front-loaded. Research into skill acquisition has found something remarkable. With just 20 to 30 hours of focused, deliberate practice, you can reach approximately 80% competence in most skills. That's not expertise. That's not world-class performance. But it's functional capability. It's the ability to do the thing reasonably well. This matters because it means that initial progress is fast. The steep part of the learning curve comes early. You're not committing to 10,000 hours to be decent at something. You're committing to 20 or 30. And that makes almost any skill accessible to you. The journey to mastery is long, yes, but the journey to competence, to that satisfying level where you can actually use the skill, that's shorter than you think, and that knowledge can change what you're willing to try. These are the foundations. Speed through focus, learning through attention, progress through systems and consistency, efficiency through respecting how your mind actually works. Let these ideas settle as you rest. Tomorrow, they'll still be here, ready to transform how you learn anything at all. Let's shift now to understanding what's actually happening inside your mind when you learn. Because once you understand how the brain really works, you can work with it instead of against it. And the first thing to know is this: the brain learns patterns, not repetitions. We often think that practice means doing something over and over mechanically until it sticks through sheer repetition. But your brain isn't a recording device that saves each repetition separately. It's a pattern recognition system. Each time you practice, your brain isn't storing that individual instance. It's extracting the underlying structure, the common elements, the pattern beneath the surface. This is why 10 thoughtful repetitions where you're noticing what's happening can be worth more than 100 mindless ones. Your brain is looking for the signal within the noise. It's asking, what's consistent here? What's the pattern I can rely on? When you practice with awareness, when you notice what's similar across attempts, you're helping your brain do what it does best: find patterns and encode them efficiently. And here's something crucial about which patterns your brain chooses to encode. The brain prioritizes usefulness. Your mind is not a neutral observer, passively recording everything it encounters. It's an active filter, constantly making decisions about what deserves energy and attention. And the primary criterion it uses is simple. Is this useful? Will this help me? Your brain has limited resources and it allocates them strategically. This is why learning happens faster when you can connect new information to practical application, to real problems, to things you actually care about. It's not that your brain is lazy, it's that your brain is efficient. It's designed to help you navigate the world successfully, and it focuses on learning what serves that purpose. When something seems abstract, disconnected from your life, your brain treats it as low priority. But when learning feels relevant, when you can see how you'll use it, Suddenly, your brain opens up. Attention sharpens. Memory strengthens. The same information, but completely different results. All because your brain has decided this matters. Now let's go deeper into what kind of information the brain finds most useful. The brain learns cause and effect faster than facts. Isolated facts are difficult to remember because they exist in isolation, disconnected from anything else. But cause and effect, that's a relationship. That's a structure your brain can grasp. When you understand that doing X leads to Y, you're not just memorizing information, you're building a mental model of how something works. And mental models are incredibly sticky. They persist. They transfer to new situations. This is why learning through experimentation, through trial and error, through seeing what happens when you change something, this kind of learning is so much faster than trying to memorize lists of facts. Your brain evolved to understand causation because causation helps you predict and control your environment. So when you're learning anything, always ask, what causes what here? What's the relationship? When you frame learning in terms of cause and effect, you're speaking your brain's native language. And this connects to something fascinating about how your brain decides what to learn. The brain prioritizes learning that reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty is costly. When you don't know what's going to happen, you have to remain vigilant, alert, prepared for anything. That's exhausting. Your brain wants to reduce uncertainty because prediction is efficient. When you can predict what's coming, you can relax, you can automate, you can free up resources for other things. This is why your brain is so motivated to learn in situations where you're uncertain. That discomfort you feel when you don't quite understand something. That's not a sign that learning isn't happening. That's a sign that learning is urgently needed. Your brain is telling you, we need to figure this out so we can predict better next time. When you embrace that uncertainty instead of avoiding it, when you deliberately practice in situations where you're not quite sure what will happen, you're creating the conditions for rapid learning. Because your brain is wired to resolve uncertainty as quickly as possible. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Learning accelerates when practice includes prediction errors. A prediction error is the gap between what you expected to happen and what actually happened. And that gap, that surprise, is one of the most powerful learning signals your brain can receive. When everything goes exactly as you predicted, there's nothing new to learn. Your model of the world is confirmed. But when something unexpected happens, your brain pays attention. It updates its model. It adjusts. This is why making mistakes when you're paying attention to them is so valuable. Each mistake is a prediction error. Each surprise is information. The fastest learners don't avoid errors. They seek out situations where errors are likely, where their current understanding will be tested and refined. They practice at the edge of their ability, where prediction errors are frequent, because that's where the learning is most dense. And you can amplify this effect deliberately. Predicting outcomes strengthens learning. Before you attempt something, pause. What do you think will happen? Make a prediction, even a rough one. Then act. Then observe what actually happens. This simple practice, predict, act, observe, transforms passive practice into active learning. Because now You're not just going through motions, you're testing hypotheses. You're engaging the same neural circuits that drive scientific thinking. And when your prediction is wrong, you get that valuable prediction error. When your prediction is right, you get confirmation that your understanding is accurate. Either way, you learn. This is why experts often practice by anticipating outcomes before they happen. They're not just executing skills, they're constantly testing and refining their internal models. And you can do this too, with any skill, at any level. Simply by adding that one step, predict first. Now let's talk about where you aim your attention during practice. Learning is faster when attention is aligned with task-relevant cues. Every situation contains hundreds of pieces of information. Most of them don't matter. A few of them are critical. The difference between fast learners and slow learners often comes down to what they're paying attention to. Fast learners have learned to filter. They focus on the cues that actually predict success, that actually matter for the task. Slow learners are often paying attention to irrelevant details or to too many things at once. This is why coaching is valuable. A good coach can tell you exactly what to pay attention to. But you can develop this skill yourself by constantly asking, what matters here? What should I be noticing? When you practice, don't just execute. Notice. And notice the right things. Over time, you'll develop an intuition for which cues matter, and your attention will automatically flow to them. That's when learning becomes almost effortless. Here's another principle about how your brain encodes information. The brain encodes contrast better than sameness. Imagine you're in a room where everything is painted the exact same shade of grey. Walls, floor, ceiling, furniture, all identical grey. You'd struggle to perceive depth, to understand the structure of the room. Now imagine one wall is painted white. Suddenly the space becomes clear. The contrast creates meaning. Your brain works the same way with information. When everything is similar, your brain struggles to create distinct memories, to build clear categories. But when you introduce contrast, when you compare things, when you highlight differences, your brain snaps into focus. This is why learning multiple related skills simultaneously can sometimes be faster than learning them sequentially. The differences between them help you understand each one more clearly. The contrast itself is information, and you can use this principle very practically. Learning is faster when examples are contrasted back to back. Instead of studying one example thoroughly, then moving to another much later, try this. Look at two contrasting examples side by side. What's different? What's the same? When you compare examples directly, you're doing the work of extracting patterns yourself. You're not waiting for someone to explain the pattern to you. You're discovering it. And discovered knowledge is stickier than delivered knowledge. This works across domains. Learning language. Compare correct and incorrect sentences. Learning design. Put good and bad examples next to each other. Learning a physical skill. Do the movement right, then deliberately do it wrong, then right again. That contrast, that back and forth, helps your brain build sharper distinctions. And sharper distinctions mean faster, more accurate learning. Finally, here's a tool that multiplies the power of pattern recognition. Naming patterns accelerates recognition. When you give something a name, when you label a pattern you've noticed, you make it visible. You make it explicit, and once it's explicit, you can see it everywhere. Before you name it, the pattern might be influencing you unconsciously, but you can't work with it deliberately. After you name it, it becomes a tool you can use. This is what experts do naturally. They develop vocabulary for the patterns in their domain. A musician might name a particular chord progression. A designer might name a layout pattern. A programmer might name a code structure. These names aren't just labels, they're handles, ways to grasp and manipulate ideas. As you learn any skill, create your own vocabulary. Notice patterns and give them names, even simple descriptive names. That act of naming transforms implicit knowledge into explicit knowledge. And explicit knowledge is knowledge you can build on, refine, and use strategically. Your brain is not a storage device, passively holding information. It's a prediction machine, actively building models of how the world works. It learns patterns, seeks usefulness, craves cause and effect, reduces uncertainty through prediction errors, encodes contrast, and organizes everything through named patterns. When you learn in alignment with these principles, you're not fighting your neurology. You're flowing with it. And that's when learning stops feeling like work and starts feeling like discovery. Rest now and let these ideas integrate. Your brain is doing its work even as you sleep, finding patterns, making connections, preparing for tomorrow. There's a fundamental misunderstanding most of us carry about learning. We think the goal is to avoid mistakes. We see errors as signs of failure, as things to minimize, as evidence that we're not good enough yet. But this perspective has it completely backward. Mistakes are not optional, they're required. Your brain doesn't learn primarily from getting things right, it learns from getting things wrong. Each error contains information that success cannot provide. When you succeed, your brain receives confirmation. Yes, this works, continue. But when you fail, your brain receives data. Something here needs adjustment, and here's exactly where the gap is. That gap, that mismatch between intention and outcome, is what drives adaptation. Without errors, your brain has nothing to correct, nothing to refine, no signal to update its models. This means that a practice session without mistakes is often a practice session without much learning. The errors aren't interrupting your progress. They are your progress. They're the raw material your brain needs to build skill. And here's something that might surprise you even more. Early errors predict faster long-term improvement. Research has shown that learners who make more mistakes in the beginning stages of acquiring a skill often end up outperforming those who started with fewer errors. This seems counterintuitive. Shouldn't early success predict continued success? But remember what we learned about the brain. It's a prediction machine that updates through prediction errors. Learners who make early mistakes are generating more learning signals. They're exploring the boundaries of the skill space. They're discovering what doesn't work, which paradoxically helps them understand what does. Learners who avoid early errors often do so by staying in safe territory, by not testing themselves, by not pushing boundaries. They feel more successful in the moment, but they're actually learning more slowly. So if you find yourself struggling early on, making mistake after mistake, Don't interpret that as evidence you're not cut out for this. Interpret it as evidence that you're learning rapidly. You're generating the errors your brain needs. In fact, there's a specific practice that leverages this principle. Struggle before instruction improves learning. The traditional model is to learn first, then apply. Receive instruction, understand the concept, then practice. But reversing this sequence is often more powerful. Struggle first. Attempt the problem before you know how to solve it. Try the skill before anyone shows you the technique. Yes, you'll fail. Yes, you'll feel confused. But that struggle primes your brain. It creates a need for the information that's coming. When instruction arrives after struggle, it lands differently. It's not abstract information you're trying to memorize. It's the answer to a question you've already asked yourself. It's the solution to a problem you've already felt. Your brain is ready for it, hungry for it. The instruction fills a gap that your struggle has made visible. This is why exploratory practice, even clumsy and error-filled, prepares you for learning in ways that passive studying cannot. This connects to a broader principle about how we acquire knowledge. Active generation beats passive consumption. When you actively try to produce something, an answer, a movement, a solution. Even if you get it wrong, you're engaging your brain more deeply than when you passively receive information. Reading about how to do something is passive. Watching someone demonstrate is passive. These activities have value, but they're not where the deepest learning happens. The deepest learning happens when you attempt to generate the thing yourself. When you try to recall information from memory instead of rereading it. When you try to solve a problem before looking at the solution. When you attempt to execute a skill before watching another demonstration. This active generation, even when it produces errors, creates stronger memory traces, deeper understanding, more durable skill. It's harder, it feels less smooth, but it works better. And the errors you make during generation aren't signs that the method is failing. They're signs that it's working exactly as it should. Now here's where many learners get stuck. They confuse learning with performance. But fast learners separate learning from performance. Performance is about executing what you already know, ideally flawlessly, often under evaluation or pressure. Learning is about expanding what you know, which necessarily involves operating at the edge of your ability, where errors are frequent. These are different activities with different goals. When you're performing, giving a presentation, competing in a game, executing a project, that's not the time for experimentation and error. But when you're practicing, when you're in learning mode, errors are welcome. The problem is that many people practice as if they're performing. They try to execute perfectly. They feel bad when they make mistakes. They're applying performance standards to learning activities. And this slows everything down. When you're learning, give yourself permission to be messy. The practice room is not the performance hall. Errors made in private, made mindfully, made as part of genuine exploration. These cost nothing and teach everything. Save the flawless execution for when it matters. During learning, prioritize exploration over perfection. And speaking of permission, there's an emotional dimension to all of this. Emotional safety increases learning speed. When you feel psychologically safe, when you're not worried about judgment, not anxious about looking foolish, not ashamed of your mistakes. Your brain can focus on learning. But when you're emotionally threatened, when errors feel dangerous, your brain shifts resources away from exploration and towards self-protection. This is why harsh criticism, even if technically accurate, often slows learning. It makes the environment feel unsafe. It makes errors feel like threats. And when errors feel like threats, you avoid them. You play it safe. You stop taking the risks that learning requires. This doesn't mean you need constant praise or that feedback should be sugar-coated. It means the emotional context matters. When you're learning alone, be kind to yourself about mistakes. When you're teaching others or learning with others, create an environment where errors are normalized, expected, even celebrated as signs of engagement. Emotional safety isn't soft. It's strategic. It's what allows the brain to do its best work. Here's an interesting way to learn from errors without making all of them yourself. Learning improves when learners observe errors made by others. You don't have to personally experience every possible mistake to benefit from them. Watching someone else make an error and seeing the consequences, this creates learning for you too. Your brain simulates their experience. It asks, what went wrong there? It builds a mental model that includes that failure mode. This is why learning with others, or studying cases of others' mistakes, can be so valuable. You're essentially borrowing their errors. You're expanding your understanding of what can go wrong without the time cost of discovering every error personally. When you observe someone struggle with something you're learning, don't look away. Pay attention. Their mistake is a gift. It's showing you something about the terrain of this skill, and your brain will encode that information almost as effectively as if you'd made the error yourself. But not all errors are equally useful. Learning improves when errors are categorized. A random mistake that you don't understand, that's just noise. But an error that you can identify, name, and understand, that's information. When you make a mistake, don't just move on. Pause. What kind of mistake was that? Was it a technical error, a conceptual misunderstanding, a lapse in attention? Different categories of errors require different solutions. Technical errors need more practice. Conceptual errors need better understanding. Attention errors need better focus or rest. When you develop a taxonomy of your own errors, when you can recognize patterns in what goes wrong, you can address root causes instead of just symptoms. This is what experts do. They don't just notice they made a mistake, they notice what type of mistake it was, and they adjust accordingly. You can develop this skill at any stage of learning. Just add one step after each error. What category does this belong to? There's also value in knowing what errors are possible before you encounter them. Early exposure to common failure modes improves resilience. When you know in advance what typically goes wrong in a domain, you're not surprised when it happens. You're prepared. You recognize it quickly. You recover faster. This is why studying failure cases early on, why learning about common pitfalls before you hit them yourself, is so valuable. It's like a mental vaccination. You're building immunity to discouragement. When the error happens, you think, yes, this is that common mistake I learned about, rather than, I must be uniquely bad at this. This knowledge that certain errors are normal, expected, part of the standard learning curve. This knowledge alone can keep you going when others quit. It transforms an experience that might feel like personal failure into a recognized step in a well-worn path. Finally, let's talk about what makes feedback truly useful. Learning improves when feedback explains why, not just what. Being told, "That's wrong," contains minimal information. Being told, "That's wrong, and here's why it's wrong, and here's what would make it right," contains actionable information. Your brain needs the causal model. It needs to understand the relationship between action and outcome. When feedback only identifies the error without explaining it, you're left guessing. You might correct this specific instance through trial and error, but you're not building transferable understanding. But when feedback includes explanation, when it illuminates the principle behind the error, you're not just fixing one mistake. You're learning a rule that will help you avoid an entire category of mistakes. This is why self-explanation, where you try to articulate why something went wrong, is so powerful. Even if no one else is there to tell you, the act of searching for your own explanation builds deeper understanding than simply noting the error and trying again. Avoiding mistakes feels productive. It feels safe. It feels like progress. But it starves the brain of learning signals. Errors are not obstacles to learning. They are the mechanism of learning. They're required, not optional. They fuel improvement, especially early on. They teach more when you struggle first, generate actively, and separate learning from performance. They work best in emotionally safe environments, when you can observe them in others, categorize them clearly, anticipate them early, and understand them deeply. The learners who advance most quickly are not those who make the fewest mistakes. They're the ones who make mistakes well. Mindfully, safely, analytically. They've learned to mine errors for information, and that makes all the difference. Rest now. Let your brain process these errors it's making even in sleep, refining, adjusting, learning. We've established that errors are essential for learning, but there's another factor that determines how much you actually learn from those errors, and that's time. Specifically, how quickly you detect them and how quickly you correct them. Because here's the truth. Immediate feedback multiplies learning speed. When you make an error and receive feedback instantly, the context is still fresh in your mind. You remember exactly what you were trying to do, what you were thinking, what you felt. The connection between action and consequence is clear and direct. Your brain can update its model immediately, while all the relevant information is still active in working memory. But when feedback is delayed, when hours or days pass between the error and the correction, that connection weakens. You have to reconstruct what you were doing. The learning signal becomes diluted. This is why practice methods that provide instant feedback are so powerful. A mirror for physical skills, a spell checker for writing, a compiler for code, immediate knowledge of results. The faster you know you've made an error, the faster you can learn from it. And that speed compounds over time, turning into dramatically accelerated skill development. But not all feedback is created equal. Learning speed increases with clear error signals. Sometimes feedback is ambiguous. You know something went wrong, but you're not sure what. You sense the outcome wasn't quite right, but you can't pinpoint why. This kind of unclear feedback is frustrating and slow. Your brain receives the signal that something needs adjustment, but it doesn't know what to adjust. So it has to guess. It has to experiment blindly. But when error signals are clear, when you know exactly what went wrong and where, learning accelerates dramatically. This is why breaking complex skills into smaller components is so effective. In a complex performance, it's hard to know which element caused the problem. But when you isolate one component, the error signal becomes crystal clear. This clarity allows for precise correction. So as you practice, always ask, is my feedback clear enough? Do I know exactly what went wrong? If not, simplify. Break it down. Create conditions where error signals are unambiguous. And once you detect an error clearly, timing matters again. Learning speed increases when errors are corrected immediately. There's a window of opportunity right after an error occurs. Your brain is in correction mode. It's ready to update. It's asking, what should I do differently? If you correct the error right then, while that window is open, the correction sticks. Your brain associates the mistake with its solution in real time. But if you continue practicing the error, if you repeat the mistake several more times before correcting it, you're actually reinforcing the wrong pattern. You're teaching your brain the error. This is why mindless repetition can be counterproductive. Quality matters more than quantity. One repetition with immediate error correction is worth more than 10 repetitions where errors go unnoticed or uncorrected. So practice slowly enough, attentively enough, that you can catch and correct errors immediately. Don't wait until the end of the session to review what went wrong. Correct as you go. Now, here's where feedback timing gets more nuanced. Early feedback should be frequent, later feedback reduced. When you're first learning something, you need lots of feedback. Constant feedback. You're building the basic model, establishing the foundational patterns, and you need frequent error correction to stay on track. Your internal sense of right and wrong isn't calibrated yet. You can't trust your own judgment. So external feedback needs to be rich and frequent. But as you develop competence, something interesting happens. If feedback remains constantly available, you can become dependent on it. You stop developing your own error detection. You wait for the feedback instead of sensing the error yourself. This is why, as you advance, it's valuable to gradually reduce feedback frequency. Give yourself opportunities to self-correct, to notice errors independently, to develop your internal sense of quality. This doesn't mean abandoning feedback entirely. It means spacing it out strategically, so you're building self-sufficiency alongside skill. In fact, the most sophisticated learners use an even more dynamic approach. Fast learners deliberately vary feedback timing. Sometimes they practice with constant feedback, using it to refine and calibrate. Sometimes they practice with no feedback at all, testing their ability to self-monitor. Sometimes they delay feedback intentionally, trying to sense errors before confirmation arrives. This variation builds multiple capabilities simultaneously. You're not just learning the skill, you're learning to detect your own errors. You're learning to perform independently. You're learning when you need external input and when you can trust yourself. This variability also prevents your brain from becoming too dependent on any single feedback structure. You become adaptable, able to learn in multiple contexts with multiple types of support. And that adaptability is itself a meta skill that makes all future learning faster. Let's talk about what makes feedback truly actionable. Learning improves when feedback includes corrective action steps. It's one thing to know you made an error. It's another thing to know what to do about it. Feedback that only identifies problems leaves you stuck. You know something's wrong, but you don't know how to fix it. This creates frustration and stalls progress. But feedback that includes a path forward, that tells you not just what went wrong, but what to try instead. This transforms obstacles into opportunities. Your brain receives both the error signal and the solution pathway. It can implement the correction immediately. This is why good coaches don't just say, "No, that's wrong." They say, "No, try it this way instead." They provide the corrective action. When you're learning independently, you can create this for yourself. When you identify an error, don't just note it. Decide on a specific corrective action. What will you do differently next time? Make that decision explicit and then implement it immediately. This turns passive error detection into active problem solving. Here's a practice that amplifies the value of any feedback you receive. Learning improves when learners estimate performance first. Before you check your work, before you get the feedback, before you see the result, pause and predict. How do you think you did? Where might the errors be? What's your confidence level? This self-assessment, even when it's wrong, is valuable. It's activating your internal monitoring system. It's forcing you to articulate your own standards. And when the actual feedback arrives, you now have two pieces of information: the objective result and your own prediction. The gap between them is telling. If you thought you did well but you didn't, that tells you your internal calibration is off. If you thought you did poorly but actually succeeded, that tells you something else. Over time, this practice of predicting before confirming trains your brain to be its own feedback system. You're developing what's called metacognitive accuracy, the ability to accurately assess your own performance. And that's one of the most powerful skills a learner can develop, because ultimately, this is what separates fast learners from slow ones. Fast learners monitor their own understanding. This is metacognition, thinking about thinking, knowing about knowing. It's the ability to step back from what you're learning and assess how well you're actually learning it. Most learners are inside the learning process, focused on the content. Fast learners are simultaneously inside and outside, both engaging with the content and monitoring their engagement. They ask themselves questions constantly. Do I actually understand this, or does it just feel familiar? Can I explain this to someone else? What parts am I confused about? Where are my gaps? This internal monitoring allows them to catch misunderstandings early, to seek help strategically, to adjust their approach before small problems become large ones. Metacognition is a skill you can develop deliberately, simply by asking yourself these kinds of questions regularly, by checking your understanding, by testing yourself honestly. The more you practice this internal monitoring, the more automatic it becomes. And here's a practical tool that supports this kind of monitoring. Skill acquisition accelerates when performance is measured. What gets measured gets managed. When you track your performance, when you have concrete metrics, clear benchmarks, visible progress, several things happen. First, you have clear feedback about whether you're improving. Second, you can identify specific weaknesses more easily. Third, you stay motivated by seeing progress accumulate. But perhaps most importantly, measurement focuses attention. When you know you're going to measure something, you pay attention to it during practice. You notice it. And attention, as we've discussed, is the foundation of learning. Measurement doesn't have to be complex or formal. It can be as simple as counting successful attempts, timing yourself, recording video, keeping a practice log. The act of measuring forces you to be specific about what you're trying to improve. And that specificity accelerates progress. Finally, let's talk about the quality of engagement with all this feedback. Fast learners ask better questions. They don't just passively receive corrections. They actively inquire. They dig deeper. When they get feedback, they ask why. They ask for examples. They ask about edge cases. They ask how this principle applies in other contexts. They're not satisfied with surface-level answers. They want to understand the underlying structure. And this questioning, this active, curious engagement with feedback, transforms information into understanding. It's not enough to know what to do. You want to know why it works, when it works, how it connects to other things you know. Better questions lead to richer answers, which lead to deeper understanding, which leads to faster learning. So don't just accept feedback passively. Engage with it. Question it. Explore it. Use it as a starting point for investigation, not an ending point for compliance. The learners who interrogate their feedback, who treat every correction as an opportunity to understand more deeply, these are the learners who advance most rapidly. Speed depends on how fast errors are detected and corrected. Immediate, clear feedback allows instant updates. Early abundance gives way to strategic reduction. Variable timing builds independence. Corrective action makes feedback useful. Self-assessment trains internal monitoring. Metacognition and measurement sharpen awareness, and better questions deepen understanding. When you optimize the entire feedback loop, when you catch errors quickly, understand them clearly, correct them immediately, and learn from them deeply, you're not just practicing, you're deliberately accelerating your own development. And that's the difference between stumbling slowly toward competence and moving there with intention and speed. Rest now knowing that even in sleep, your brain is consolidating these feedback loops, strengthening these monitoring systems, preparing you to learn faster tomorrow than you did today. Not all practice is equal. You can spend hours repeating something and still not improve. You can drill endlessly and find yourself stagnating. Because the truth is, not all practice strengthens memory. Some practice is too easy, too comfortable, too automatic. It feels like progress because you're executing smoothly, but that smoothness means you're not learning anymore. You're just performing what you already know. Real learning, the kind that actually builds skill, happens in a very specific zone. And here's where you learn faster by practicing at the edge of ability. The edge is that place where success is possible, but not guaranteed, where you have to reach slightly beyond what you can comfortably do, where some attempts succeed and some fail. This is the zone of optimal challenge. Too far below your ability, and you're not learning, you're just maintaining. Too far above your ability, and you're overwhelmed, just thrashing without real progress. But right at the edge where you're stretching but not breaking, that's where the brain builds new capacity most efficiently. So, the question to ask yourself during practice isn't, can I do this? It's, is this challenging me appropriately? If practice feels comfortable, if you're succeeding consistently without effort, you're probably not at the edge. Move to something harder. That's where the learning is. But getting to the edge isn't a one-time adjustment. Learning improves when difficulty increases gradually. This is the principle of progressive overload, borrowed from physical training, but applicable to any skill. You start where you are, you practice until that level becomes comfortable. Then you increase the difficulty slightly. Then you practice at that new level until it becomes comfortable. Then you increase again. Small, incremental steps up the difficulty ladder. This gradual progression keeps you in the learning zone consistently. If you increase difficulty too quickly, you exceed your capacity and learning slows or stops. If you increase difficulty too slowly or not at all, you plateau. The art is finding the right pace of escalation. Just enough challenge that you're always reaching, never so much that you're drowning. And this requires honest self-assessment. You have to pay attention to your performance and adjust difficulty based on what you observe. When something becomes easy, that's your signal to level up. In fact, this adjustment should be happening regularly. Fast learners recalibrate difficulty frequently. They don't set it once and forget it. They're constantly checking, is this still challenging me? Have I adapted to this level? They might adjust difficulty mid-session if they notice they're performing too easily or struggling too much. They might adjust between sessions based on how the last practice went. This frequent recalibration keeps them in that optimal learning zone far more consistently than learners who practice the same routine, regardless of how their ability changes. Think of difficulty as a dial that needs constant tuning. Too often, learners find a practice routine that worked once and then repeat it indefinitely, even as their skill evolves. But what challenged you last week might be too easy this week. What was impossible last month might be perfect now. Stay attentive. Adjust constantly. Keep yourself at the edge. Now, working at the edge of ability requires something important. Learning improves when practice has a clear success criterion. You need to know what you're aiming for. What does success look like for this practice attempt? Without a clear criterion, you can't tell if you're improving. You can't calibrate difficulty. You can't give yourself meaningful feedback. Everything becomes vague and subjective. But when you define success clearly, when you know that the goal is to execute this movement smoothly 3 times in a row, or to solve this type of problem in under 2 minutes, or to perform this sequence without hesitation. Now you have a target. Now each attempt has a clear outcome. You succeeded or you didn't. And that clarity accelerates learning. It focuses attention on what matters. It provides unambiguous feedback. It allows you to track progress precisely. So before each practice session, before each drill, ask yourself, what's my success criterion here? What am I trying to achieve? Make it specific. Make it measurable. Make it clear. But here's something important about how you frame those goals. Learning improves when goals are process-focused. There's a difference between outcome goals and process goals. An outcome goal is about the result. Win the game, get the promotion, finish the project. A process goal is about the behaviors. Practice for 30 minutes. Execute this technique correctly. Complete this training sequence. Outcome goals have their place, but for moment-to-moment practice, process goals are more powerful because you control the process. You can execute on a process goal regardless of external circumstances. And process goals keep you focused on improvement rather than judgment. When your goal is to execute a technique correctly, you're learning every time you practice it, regardless of the ultimate outcome. When your goal is only to win or succeed, every failure feels like complete failure. But when your goal is to follow the right process, every attempt where you follow that process is a success, even if the outcome isn't perfect yet. This keeps you in a learning mindset. It keeps you focused on what you can control. And paradoxically, this focus on process often leads to better outcomes than obsessing over outcomes directly. Let's talk about how to make practice more robust. Practicing under slightly varied constraints improves robustness. If you only practice something in one specific way, in one specific context, your learning becomes brittle. It works under those exact conditions but falls apart when anything changes. But when you practice with variation, different environments, different equipment, different times of day, different mental states, you're building flexible, adaptable skill. Your brain is learning the core pattern that persists across all these variations, rather than memorizing one specific instance. This is why athletes practice in different venues, why musicians practice pieces at different tempos, why language learners practice with different conversation partners. The variation forces your brain to extract what's essential and ignore what's incidental. And that extraction builds true understanding. So introduce variation deliberately. Don't practice the same way every time. Change something. A small constraint, a small variation. And watch how that makes your skill more resilient. There's a related principle about how you sequence your practice. Skills improve faster when practice is slightly randomized. Instead of drilling the same thing over and over in a block, 10 free throws, then 10 layups, then 10 three-pointers. Mix them up. Free throw, layup, three-pointer. Free throw, three-pointer, layup. This randomization feels less smooth. You don't get into a rhythm. Each attempt requires you to think about what you're doing. And that slight additional difficulty, that need to recall and set up differently each time, that makes the learning stronger. Blocked practice feels more successful in the moment because you get into a groove. But randomized practice builds skills that last, skills that transfer, skills that you can access flexibly rather than only in a specific sequence. This applies to mental skills as much as physical ones. Studying, don't do all the problems of one type, then all the problems of another type. Mix them up. The slight confusion, the need to identify which approach each problem requires. That's building deeper understanding. This mixing has a specific name and powerful effects. Interleaving improves skill transfer. Interleaving means mixing different but related skills or concepts during practice rather than learning them separately. When you interleave, you're forced to discriminate between them. You're noticing what makes this skill different from that skill. And that discrimination, that active comparison, builds clearer mental models. It helps you understand when to use which skill. It prevents you from just memorizing procedures and helps you understand principles. Studies have shown that interleaved practice, while harder and less satisfying during the practice itself, produces better long-term retention and better transfer to new situations. So resist the temptation to master one thing completely before moving to the next. Instead, work on related skills in parallel, switching between them. Let them inform each other. Let the contrast clarify both. And here's something about when to introduce this variation. Variability early in practice improves long-term retention. There's a traditional view that you should start with perfect, consistent practice and only introduce variation once you've mastered the basic form. But research suggests the opposite is often better. Introducing variation early, practicing in different contexts, with different approaches, under different conditions right from the start. This actually speeds learning and improves retention. Yes, it feels messier. Yes, progress feels slower at first. But you're building flexibility into the skill from the beginning. You're avoiding the brittle mastery that comes from too consistent practice. Your brain is learning to adapt from day one. So don't wait until something feels perfect to start varying your practice. Introduce variation early. Let yourself practice messily. Let yourself try different approaches. That early variability will pay dividends in how robust and flexible your eventual skill becomes. Finally, let's talk about a specific type of difficulty that's particularly valuable. Retrieval difficulty improves long-term performance. When you're trying to remember something, trying to recall how to do something, and it takes effort. When the retrieval isn't immediate and automatic but requires mental work, that difficulty is actually strengthening the memory. This is why testing yourself is more powerful than rereading. Rereading is easy. The information is right there. But testing requires retrieval, and retrieval under difficulty creates stronger, more durable memories. This applies to physical skills too. When you have to recall and reconstruct how to perform a technique, rather than just repeating it mindlessly, you're strengthening your ability to access that skill. So embrace retrieval difficulty. Space out your practice so that you're not just performing while everything is fresh. Give yourself time to forget a little, then force yourself to retrieve. Take breaks between practice sessions. When you return, you'll have to work harder to remember. And that harder work builds stronger learning. Easy practice feels productive. Difficult practice is productive. Not all practice strengthens memory. Only practice at the edge of ability, gradually progressing, frequently recalibrated, guided by clear criteria and process goals. Practice that varies constraints, randomizes sequence, interleaves related skills, introduces variability early, and embraces retrieval difficulty. This kind of practice is harder. It's less comfortable. It doesn't feel as smooth or satisfying in the moment, but it builds skills that last, that transfer, that adapt. It builds real competence, not just the illusion of it. So the next time you practice anything, ask yourself, am I making this appropriately difficult? Am I at the edge? Am I varying enough? Am I challenging myself to retrieve? Because the quality of your practice determines the quality of your learning. And now, rest. Let your brain consolidate these principles. Tomorrow, you can practice them. And that practice will be different, more intentional, more effective than it was before. When you look at a complex skill from the outside, it can feel overwhelming. There's so much to track, so much to coordinate, so many elements happening simultaneously. How could you possibly learn all of that? But here's the secret that makes complexity manageable. Skills are built from sub-skills. That intimidating complex performance you're watching is not one monolithic thing. It's a combination of smaller, simpler components that have been integrated together. A tennis serve is a weight shift, plus a toss, plus a rotation, plus an arm motion, plus timing. A presentation is research, plus structure, plus delivery, plus slides, plus audience awareness. When you see the whole, it seems impossible. But when you see the parts, each part is learnable. This is the fundamental principle of skill acquisition. You don't learn complex things directly. You learn the components, then you learn to combine them. And this means that any skill, no matter how sophisticated, can be broken down into teachable, learnable pieces. Your job as a learner is to find those pieces. And when you find them, something important happens. Chunking reduces cognitive overload. Remember that your working memory can only hold a limited amount of information at once. When you're trying to consciously manage 10 different elements simultaneously, you exceed that capacity. Everything feels overwhelming. You can't track it all. But chunking is the process of grouping related elements into single units. Instead of thinking about 5 separate finger movements, you think about the chord. Instead of tracking 4 separate steps, you think about the sequence. Each chunk occupies only one slot in working memory, even though it represents multiple underlying actions. This is how experts handle complexity that would overwhelm beginners. They've chunked the elements. What takes a beginner 10 pieces of working memory takes an expert 2 or 3 chunks. And this frees up mental space for higher-level concerns: strategy, creativity, adaptation. So as you practice, pay attention to what can be grouped together. Look for natural chunks. Create them deliberately. Name them, and practice them as units until they become automatic. That's how you build capacity for complexity. But you don't always need to practice the whole thing at once. Partial task practice accelerates complex skills. Sometimes the most efficient way to improve a complex performance is to extract one component and practice it in isolation. Take it out of the full context where there's so much else to track. Focus on just that one element. Get it solid, then put it back into the whole. This is why musicians practice difficult passages separately, why athletes drill specific movements, why public speakers rehearse particular sections of their talk. Partial task practice lets you concentrate all your attention on one sub-skill without the distraction and cognitive load of everything else. And once that component becomes automatic, once it requires less conscious attention, you can integrate it back into the full performance. Then extract another component. Isolate, master, integrate. This cycle, repeated across all the sub-skills, builds complex capability much faster than always practicing the full task, where your attention is spread thin across everything at once. And here's where strategic thinking comes in. Fast learners isolate bottlenecks. Not all sub-skills are equally important. Not all weaknesses matter equally. There's usually one or two components that are limiting your overall performance. These are your bottlenecks. Maybe everything else is solid, but this one element is still shaky, and it drags everything else down. Fast learners identify these bottlenecks through honest self-assessment. They ask, what's actually holding me back? What's my weakest link? And then they invest disproportionate practice time there, because improving a bottleneck improves your overall performance dramatically. But improving something you're already good at yields diminishing returns. This requires setting ego aside. It requires admitting where you're weakest. But that admission is the path to rapid progress. Find your bottleneck. That's where your practice time will be most valuable. There's another way to reduce complexity, especially early on. Fast learners reduce decision points early. When you're first learning something complex, having to make many decisions slows everything down. Each decision consumes mental energy. Each choice point is a place where you might hesitate, might choose wrong, might overload your working memory. So fast learners deliberately reduce the number of decisions they have to make during early practice. They might use a simplified version of the task with fewer options. They might follow a prescribed sequence rather than choosing dynamically. They might eliminate variables that aren't essential yet. This isn't about dumbing things down permanently. It's about managing cognitive load strategically. Get the basic pattern solid with minimal decisions. Then gradually reintroduce complexity and choice. Let decision-making ability develop alongside technical skill, rather than trying to master both simultaneously from the start. This staged approach, simple first, complex later, respects how the brain actually learns. In fact, this progression has a name. Learning improves when examples go simple to complex. Whether you're learning from examples, from problems, from cases, the sequence matters. Start with the simplest, clearest instances. The ones where the pattern is most obvious, where there's least ambiguity, where success is most achievable. Let your brain build the basic model there. Then gradually introduce more complex examples, ones with more nuance, more variables, more ambiguity. Each step up in complexity builds on the foundation of the simpler cases. This seems obvious, but it's often violated. Sometimes learners jump straight to complex, realistic examples because they want to be challenged, because simple examples feel too easy. But that jump often means struggling without a foundation, building on sand. Start simple. Let the pattern become clear, then increase complexity systematically. Your brain will build a more robust, more flexible understanding this way than if you dive into complexity before you're ready. Now, all of this decomposition and practice requires clarity about what you're aiming for. Clear goals increase learning speed. We touched on this earlier with success criteria, but it bears repeating. When you know exactly what you're trying to achieve, attention focuses, effort aligns, feedback becomes meaningful. But when goals are vague, when you're just generally trying to get better or practice more, progress becomes vague too. You can't tell if you're improving. You can't calibrate your difficulty. You can't celebrate successes or learn from failures because you don't know what success and failure look like. So make your goals specific. Not practice guitar, but learn to play this chord progression smoothly at 80 beats per minute. Not improve my writing, but write 3 paragraphs with clear topic sentences. Specificity transforms abstract intention into concrete action, and concrete action produces results. Part of that clarity is knowing when you're finished. Fast learners explicitly define what done means. How do you know when you've achieved the goal? What does completion look like? This prevents endless, unfocused practice. It prevents perfectionism from keeping you stuck on one component forever when you should move on. It gives you permission to stop when appropriate and advance to the next challenge. For each practice goal, each sub-skill, each component you're working on, define done. Maybe it's 5 successful repetitions in a row. Maybe it's performing without hesitation. Maybe it's receiving specific feedback from a coach. Whatever it is, make it explicit. Then when you reach it, acknowledge that achievement. Complete the cycle and move forward. This clarity about completion keeps your practice efficient and progressive rather than circular and stuck. Here's something that might seem counterintuitive. Fast learners deliberately revisit fundamentals. You might think that once you've mastered the basics, you should leave them behind and work only on advanced techniques. But the most sophisticated learners regularly return to foundational skills. They practice them with fresh eyes. They find deeper layers in what once seemed simple. They ensure that their foundation remains solid as they build higher. Because here's what happens. As you advance, you understand the fundamentals differently. You see nuances you missed as a beginner. You can execute them with refinement that wasn't possible before. And often, advanced problems are actually fundamental problems in disguise. The issue isn't that you need a more advanced technique. It's that some fundamental element has degraded or was never quite solid. So periodically returning to basics, not as a sign of failure, but as a deliberate practice choice. This keeps your entire skill structure sound. The foundation supports everything above it. Keep it strong. In fact, there's deep value in this kind of return. Skill mastery accelerates when revisiting first principles. First principles are the core concepts, the fundamental truths, the basic building blocks from which everything else derives. When you return to first principles after gaining experience, something magical happens. You see connections you couldn't see before. You understand why things work, not just how. You can derive solutions rather than just remembering procedures. This is the difference between superficial knowledge and deep understanding. Superficial knowledge is a collection of techniques and facts. Deep understanding is insight into underlying structure and principles. And that understanding comes not just from learning first principles once, but from returning to them repeatedly at different stages of your development. Each time you revisit them, you understand them more deeply, and that deeper understanding makes everything else you learn easier, faster, more intuitive. So don't think of fundamentals as something you graduate from. Think of them as something you spiral back to, seeing them anew each time. Complexity is conquered through decomposition. Break skills into sub-skills. Chunk elements together. Practice parts in isolation. Identify and address bottlenecks. Reduce early decisions. Progress from simple to complex. Define clear goals and explicit completion criteria. Return to fundamentals regularly. Revisit first principles with experienced eyes. This is how you make the impossible possible. Not by tackling everything at once, but by breaking it down, building it up piece by piece, layer by layer. And here's the beautiful thing. Once you learn this approach with one skill, you can apply it to any skill. The meta skill of decomposition. The ability to break down complexity and reconstruct it systematically. This is perhaps the most valuable learning skill of all. Rest now. Your brain is chunking these ideas even as you sleep, building them into your own framework for learning. Tomorrow, you'll see complex challenges differently. You'll see the parts within the whole, and that vision will make everything learnable. There's a common assumption that learning only happens during active practice, that when you stop practicing, learning stops. But this assumption is fundamentally wrong. Learning continues after practice ends. In fact, some of the most important learning processes happen when you're not actively engaged with the skill at all. Your brain doesn't just record experiences during practice and then sit idle afterward. It actively processes, consolidates, and reorganizes what you've practiced. And understanding this, understanding that rest is part of learning, not a break from it. This changes everything about how you approach skill development. The most powerful example of this is sleep. Sleep is a hidden learning accelerator. While you sleep, your brain is replaying the patterns you practiced during the day. Neural connections are being strengthened. Skills are being consolidated from temporary storage into long-term memory. This isn't metaphorical, it's neurologically observable. Studies have shown that sleep significantly improves skill retention and performance, sometimes producing improvements that exceed what additional practice would have yielded. People who sleep after learning a motor skill perform better the next day than people who stayed awake, even if they had the same amount of total rest time. Sleep isn't just recovery. It's when your brain does some of its deepest learning work. This means that a practice session followed by good sleep is more valuable than a longer practice session without sleep. It means that all-night cramming is neurologically inefficient. It means that if you want to accelerate learning, protecting your sleep is not optional. It's essential. The hours you spend unconscious are hours your brain spends making you more skilled. And even during waking hours, knowing when to stop is crucial. Learning improves when practice ends before exhaustion. There's a temptation to push through, to keep practicing when you're tired, to extract every possible minute from your practice session. But exhausted practice is low-quality practice. When you're fatigued, your attention wanders, your form degrades. You start making errors you wouldn't make when fresh. And if you're not careful, you start practicing those errors, encoding bad patterns. Worse, exhausted practice can create negative associations. It can make the skill feel like suffering. So the strategic move is to stop while you're still fresh enough to execute well. End the session when quality is still high. This does several things. It preserves your enthusiasm for the next session. It ensures the last repetitions you encode are good ones. And it leaves your brain in a state where it can consolidate effectively, rather than just recovering from depletion. Less exhausted practice often produces more learning than more exhausted practice. Quality, not quantity. Stop early, stop smart. In fact, the rhythm of practice and rest matters deeply. Alternating practice and rest improves neural efficiency. This isn't just about avoiding exhaustion, it's about how the brain consolidates learning. When you practice, you're activating neural patterns. When you rest, your brain processes those patterns, strengthens the connections, prunes what's unnecessary. Then when you return to practice, you're often surprisingly better than when you left. This is why distributed practice, practicing a little, resting, practicing again, is more effective than massed practice, where you try to do everything in one marathon session. The rest intervals aren't wasted time. They're when consolidation happens. They're when the learning becomes durable, so build rest into your practice structure deliberately. Not as a concession to weakness, but as a strategic element of the learning process itself. Practice, rest, practice, rest. This rhythm is how the brain learns most efficiently. And during those rest periods, there's something else you can do. Physical movement enhances learning. This might seem unrelated, but the research is clear. Light physical activity, a walk, some stretching, gentle movement, can actually improve cognitive processing and memory consolidation. Movement increases blood flow to the brain. It can improve mood and reduce stress, both of which support learning. And there may be deeper connections. The brain evolved to coordinate movement, and there's evidence that motor systems and cognitive systems are more intertwined than we typically assume. So between practice sessions, move. Don't just sit and passively rest. Walk around, stretch. Do something physical. This isn't a distraction from learning. It's supporting the learning process in ways that pure mental activity cannot. Your body and brain are not separate systems. They're one integrated system. And when you care for the whole system, learning accelerates. Here's another practice that leverages the power of time. Learning improves when progress is reviewed after a delay. Immediate review has value, but there's something special about returning to assess your progress after hours or days have passed. The delay allows consolidation to occur. It allows you to see your work with fresh eyes, and it creates an opportunity for what's called spaced retrieval. You have to recall what you learned, which strengthens the memory. So after a practice session, yes, do a brief review, but also schedule a review for later. The next day or a few days later, return and assess. How much did you retain? What feels automatic now that felt difficult before? What still needs work? This delayed review gives you accurate information about what's actually been learned versus what was temporarily available during practice. And it creates another learning opportunity through the act of retrieval itself. Don't just practice and move on. Return, review, consolidate through recollection. And here's something encouraging about that return. Relearning is faster than initial learning. If you learn something, then let it fade, then learn it again. That second learning is much quicker than the first. Skills you once knew are not truly lost. They're dormant, and they can be awakened rapidly. This is both encouraging and strategic. It's encouraging because it means that breaks in practice, even long ones, aren't as costly as you might fear. The skill remains latent, ready to resurface. And it's strategic because it suggests that broadly learning many things, even if you don't maintain all of them simultaneously, is more efficient than you might think. Each skill you learn makes relearning it easier. So don't be afraid of breaks. Don't feel like everything is lost if you have to step away for a while. The neural pathways remain. And when you return, you'll be surprised how quickly things come back. That foundation, once built, is more permanent than it feels. Now let's talk about how you end your practice sessions. Learning improves when sessions end on success. The last experience of a practice session has disproportionate weight. It's what you'll remember most vividly. It's the emotional tone you'll associate with the activity. So if possible, structure your practice so that you end on a positive note. If you're working on something difficult and failing repeatedly, don't let that be the last experience. Drop down to something easier that you can execute successfully. End with a win. This does several things. It maintains motivation and positive associations with the skill. It encodes a successful pattern as the closing memory of the session. And it ensures you're approaching the next session with confidence rather than dread. This doesn't mean avoiding difficulty. It means sequencing strategically. Do the hard work in the middle of the session when you're fresh, but end on success. Your brain will thank you. Here's a practical tool for structuring your practice time. Learning improves when goals are time-bounded. Open-ended practice is difficult to maintain. Without a clear endpoint, it's hard to commit fully. You're always wondering, should I keep going? Am I done? Energy drains away into this uncertainty. But when you set a clear time boundary, I will practice for 30 minutes, or I will work on this until 3 p.m., something shifts. You can commit completely for that defined period. You know exactly what you're agreeing to. And often, that commitment produces more focused, more productive practice than longer but unfocused sessions. Time bounding also prevents the perfectionism that can keep you stuck. You practice for the allotted time. Then you move on, whether you've achieved perfection or not. This keeps you progressing through a curriculum rather than obsessing over single elements. So set time boundaries, practice within them fully, then stop. The constraint creates focus. The end point creates completion. And both support effective learning. And here's something about what makes practice most engaging. Learning accelerates when tasks have immediate consequences. When you can see the result of your action right away, when cause and effect are tightly linked, learning happens rapidly. This is why video games are such effective learning environments. Every action produces immediate feedback. You try something, you see what happens, you adjust. The loop is fast and clear. You can apply this principle to any practice. Make the consequences of your actions as immediate as possible. Use tools that show results instantly. Practice in ways that reveal success or failure quickly. The tighter the feedback loop, the faster the learning. Delayed consequences, where you won't know if you succeeded for hours or days. These slow learning dramatically. So whenever possible, structure practice for immediacy. Find ways to know right now whether your attempt worked. That immediate consequence drives rapid iteration and adjustment. Finally, let's talk about what makes all of this worthwhile. Learning improves when outcomes are meaningful. You can do everything technically right. Perfect practice structure, optimal rest, good feedback. But if you don't care about the outcome, learning will still be slow. Meaning matters. When the skill connects to something you value, when the progress serves a purpose that matters to you, motivation sustains itself. Attention comes naturally. Persistence through difficulty feels worthwhile. You don't need to manufacture willpower because the meaning provides its own energy. So if you're struggling to learn something, examine whether it's meaningful to you. If it's not, either find the meaning in it or question whether you should be learning it at all. Life is short. Learning capacity is precious. Invest it in skills that matter. And when you do, when you're learning something genuinely meaningful, everything else becomes easier. The practice feels less like obligation and more like pursuit. And that shift, from should to want, from duty to desire, that's when learning becomes not just effective but joyful. Learning continues after practice ends, in sleep, in rest, in the spaces between active engagement, through movement, through delayed review, through the surprising ease of relearning, by ending on success, by bounding your time, by creating immediate consequences for meaningful outcomes. The practice session is important, but it's only part of the story. The rest of the story happens in the hours and days afterward, when your brain is quietly, invisibly, powerfully transforming effort into ability. Trust that process. Practice well, then rest well. Your brain knows what to do with both. And when you return tomorrow, you'll find that you're better than when you left. Not because you practiced while you slept, but because sleep itself was practice. Rest now. Let consolidation begin. The learning continues. There's a certain appeal to the idea of brute force learning. Just put in the hours. Grind through the repetitions. Sheer volume will eventually produce results. And yes, time and effort matter. But here's the truth. Smart amplification beats brute force. There are techniques, approaches, methods that multiply the effectiveness of your practice time. That transform ordinary effort into extraordinary results. And the first of these might surprise you. Teaching a skill improves mastery. When you explain something to someone else, when you have to articulate how it works, when you answer their questions and clarify their confusions, you're not just helping them learn, you're deepening your own understanding. Teaching forces you to organize your knowledge, to make it explicit, to find the gaps in your own understanding. You discover what you thought you knew, but don't quite. And in filling those gaps, in clarifying for others, you clarify for yourself. This is why study groups where students teach each other can be more effective than studying alone. This is why the person who explains the concept often learns more than the people listening. So if you want to accelerate your own mastery, find opportunities to teach. Explain what you're learning to a friend, to a colleague, even to an imaginary student. The act of teaching will reveal and strengthen your understanding in ways that passive review never could. And there's a related practice you can do even when alone. Learning accelerates when learners verbalize strategies. Talk yourself through what you're doing. Explain your thinking out loud. When you're solving a problem, don't just solve it. Narrate your process. I'm noticing this pattern, so I'm going to try this approach. That didn't work, so now I'm considering why. Maybe the issue is here. This externalization of your thinking does several things. It slows you down enough to be deliberate rather than automatic. It makes your reasoning visible so you can examine it. It helps you notice patterns in your own thinking, and it converts implicit processes into explicit knowledge. Expert performers often think aloud during practice for exactly this reason. They're not just executing, they're observing their own execution, narrating their strategies, making their expertise explicit to themselves. You can do this too. Just speak. Describe what you're doing and why. That simple act amplifies learning dramatically. Here's something about the medium you use for learning. Writing by hand improves conceptual learning. In our digital age, typing is faster and more convenient. But there's something about the physical act of writing, the slower pace, the motor engagement. It produces deeper processing. When you write notes by hand, you can't transcribe everything verbatim. You have to select, you have to summarize, you have to process. And that processing during encoding creates stronger memory and better understanding than passive transcription. Studies have shown that students who take handwritten notes perform better on conceptual questions than those who type, even when both groups study their notes later. The learning happens during the writing, not just during the review. So when you're learning something complex, when you're trying to understand deeply, reach for pen and paper. The ancient technology still works. The physical engagement, the forced summarization, the slower pace that allows processing. These create learning that keyboard input doesn't quite match. In fact, the more senses you can involve, the better. Using multiple sensory channels strengthens encoding. Your brain has different processing systems for different types of information. Visual, auditory, kinesthetic. When you engage multiple channels simultaneously, you're creating multiple pathways to the same memory, multiple ways to access the same knowledge. This is why demonstrations that you watch and simultaneously try to imitate work so well. You're seeing it, hearing the explanation, and feeling it in your body. All three channels encoding the same information. So when you're learning, look for ways to engage multiple senses. Don't just read about something. Draw it, speak it, move it, build it. Each additional sensory channel is another route your brain can use to store and retrieve the information. And when multiple routes exist, the knowledge becomes more robust, more accessible, more durable. Here's something remarkable about the brain's capabilities. Mental rehearsal works like real practice. When you vividly imagine performing a skill, when you mentally walk through the movements or the process, your brain activates many of the same neural pathways as physical practice. Not all of them, but a surprising number. This means you can practice to some degree without physical execution. Athletes use this constantly, visualizing their performance before competition. Musicians mentally rehearse passages. Surgeons mentally walk through procedures. And research shows this mental practice produces measurable improvement. Not as much as physical practice, but significant nonetheless. And mental practice has advantages. You can do it anywhere, anytime. You can practice even when tired or injured. You can slow down time. Rehearsing complex sequences at whatever speed allows perfect execution in your mind. So add mental rehearsal to your toolkit. Before practice, visualize what you'll do. After practice, replay successful attempts mentally. During breaks, rehearse mentally. You're not just thinking about the skill, you're actually practicing it in a neurologically meaningful way. Now let's talk about how to accelerate understanding of new concepts. Analogies accelerate understanding. When you encounter something unfamiliar, something complex, the fastest way to grasp it is often through comparison to something you already know. An analogy bridges the gap between known and unknown. It lets you transfer understanding from one domain to another. This is why good teachers use analogies constantly. The heart is like a pump. Electricity flows like water through pipes. This data structure is like a filing cabinet. These aren't just simplifications, they're cognitive tools that let you leverage existing knowledge to understand new information. And you can create your own analogies. When learning something new, ask yourself, what is this like? What do I already know that resembles this? The analogy might not be perfect. In fact, it probably won't be. But it gives you a starting point, a framework, a way to think about the new thing until you understand it well enough to think about it on its own terms. Don't underestimate the power of a good analogy. It can collapse hours of confusion into moments of clarity. And speaking of leveraging what you know, prior knowledge accelerates new learning. This is one of the most robust findings in learning science. The more you already know about a domain, the faster you learn new information within that domain. Each piece of knowledge is a hook that new knowledge can attach to. Each concept understood is a foundation that new concepts can build on. This creates a rich, get richer dynamic. The more you know, the easier it becomes to know more. This is why experts can learn new information in their field almost effortlessly, while beginners struggle with the same information. The expert has a vast network of existing knowledge that the new information can integrate into. The beginner has no such network, so early learning is slower, but it accelerates. Each thing you learn makes the next thing easier. And this has a practical implication. When entering a new field, invest time in building foundational knowledge. Learn the vocabulary. Understand the core concepts. Build the basic framework. That investment will compound, making all subsequent learning faster. You're not just learning information, you're building infrastructure that will support all future learning in that domain. And part of building that infrastructure is creating something explicit. Building explicit mental models improves adaptation. A mental model is your understanding of how something works, the relationships, the causation, the principles. When this model is implicit, when you just kind of know how to do something without being able to articulate why. Your ability to adapt is limited, but when your model is explicit, when you can describe the structure, explain the principles, predict what will happen in new situations, then you can adapt, innovate, troubleshoot. Explicit models are transferable. They work in new contexts. They allow you to derive solutions rather than just remember procedures. So as you learn, work to make your mental models explicit. Draw diagrams. Write explanations. Test your model by making predictions. The effort to externalize your understanding will reveal gaps and strengthen the model itself. And that explicit model becomes a tool you can use far beyond the specific context where you learned it. Here's a powerful but often overlooked learning tool. Learning improves when learners observe experts, not just to copy what they do, but to see how they think. Expert performance looks effortless, but that effortlessness hides immense complexity. When you watch an expert work, pay attention to more than just the outcome. Notice their process. How do they approach problems? What do they pay attention to? What do they ignore? How do they recover from errors? What patterns do you see in their decisions? This kind of observation is active learning. You're not just passively watching. You're studying. You're extracting principles. You're building your own mental model based on their demonstrated expertise. And when possible, get inside their head. Ask them to think aloud. Ask them to explain their reasoning. The gap between novice and expert is largely a gap in what they notice and how they think. And observation, done thoughtfully, helps you close that gap without having to discover everything through personal trial and error. Finally, here's something about how to approach learning a complex skill. Early exposure to the whole skill matters. There's a traditional approach that says, learn part A, master it, then learn part B, master it, then combine them. And yes, decomposition is valuable. But there's also value in experiencing the whole skill early, even if you can't execute it well yet. This early exposure gives you context. It shows you how the parts fit together. It helps you understand why each component matters. It prevents you from learning parts in ways that don't integrate well later. So even if you're going to focus on components, start with at least one attempt at the whole skill. Get a sense of the entire thing. Then decompose. Practice the parts. But return to the whole regularly. This cycle, whole to whole, creates understanding that pure part practice doesn't. You learn components with context. You understand how they serve the larger performance. And when you return to the whole, you're not just assembling pieces. You're performing an integrated skill that you understand both analytically and holistically. Smart amplification beats brute force. Teach to learn. Verbalize your strategies, write by hand. Engage multiple senses. Rehearse mentally. Use analogies. Leverage prior knowledge. Build explicit models. Observe experts. Experience the whole early. These aren't shortcuts that bypass effort. They're multipliers that make your effort more effective. 2 hours of practice with these techniques can produce more learning than 10 hours without them. Not because they're magic, but because they align with how the brain actually processes, encodes, and retrieves information. They're working with your neurology, not against it. And that alignment, that's the difference between struggling uphill and flowing downhill. Same destination, different experience, different speed. Rest now, knowing that your brain is integrating these amplification techniques even as you sleep. Tomorrow, your practice will be smarter, not just harder. And smart practice is what builds mastery. The fastest learners share a particular characteristic. They don't just practice, they observe themselves practicing. They monitor, they adjust. They create feedback loops that continuously correct and optimize their approach. Fast learning is a self-correcting loop. It's a system that notices what's working, amplifies it, notices what isn't working, and modifies it. And this system starts with visibility. Fast learners track progress visually. They don't just feel whether they're improving. They know. They create visible records of their practice, charts that show performance over time, logs that track successful repetitions, graphs that reveal patterns. This visibility does several things. It provides objective feedback that cuts through subjective feelings. You might feel like you're not improving, but the chart shows you are. Or you might feel like you're doing great, but the data reveals a plateau. Visual tracking also maintains motivation. Seeing progress accumulate is deeply satisfying. It makes the invisible visible. And perhaps most importantly, visual tracking helps you notice patterns. You see that your performance improves on certain days, declines on others. You notice that particular types of practice produce better results. The data becomes a teacher, revealing insights about your own learning process that you'd miss without it. So find a way to track what you're practicing. Make your progress visible. Your brain responds powerfully to visual evidence of growth. And here's something about control. Learning improves when practice difficulty is learner-controlled. When someone else sets the difficulty for you, there's always some mismatch. Too easy for your current ability, or too hard. But you know your own state better than anyone else. You know when you're ready for more challenge and when you need to consolidate. Fast learners take control of their difficulty level. They adjust it session by session, sometimes moment by moment. Feeling sharp today? Increase the challenge. Feeling foggy? Drop back to something manageable. Had a breakthrough? Push forward. Hitting a wall? Simplify and rebuild. This self-regulation keeps you in the optimal learning zone far more consistently than following a predetermined progression. It requires honesty with yourself. It requires resisting ego-driven choices that push you beyond productive challenge into counterproductive overwhelm. But when you get it right, when you're truly calibrating difficulty to your current capacity, learning accelerates. You're not waiting for a curriculum to catch up or keep up. You're moving at exactly your speed. Now let's talk about rewards and how they affect learning. Learning improves when rewards are informational. There are different types of rewards. External rewards like money, grades, prizes. These can motivate, but they don't directly improve learning. In fact, they can sometimes distract from the learning itself. But informational rewards, feedback that tells you how you're doing, knowledge that you've improved, evidence that you've mastered something. These rewards are tightly coupled to learning. They tell you what's working. They guide your attention. They satisfy curiosity. Fast learners seek informational rewards. They want to know how they did, not just whether they succeeded or failed. They want the feedback, the insight, the data. And they find this feedback inherently rewarding. When you shift your focus from external validation to informational feedback, learning becomes self-sustaining. The information itself becomes the reward. You practice not for grades or praise, but for the satisfaction of knowing you've gotten better, of seeing the improvement in the data, of feeling the skill become more automatic. Cultivate appreciation for informational rewards. They're the fuel for self-directed learning. Here's something practical about building consistency. Learning speed improves with consistent rituals. A ritual is a predictable sequence of actions that prepares you for practice. Maybe you make tea, sit in a specific chair, put on certain music, review your goals, then begin. The specific elements don't matter as much as the consistency. The ritual becomes a signal to your brain. We're entering practice mode now. It reduces the friction of starting. It bypasses the need for motivation because the ritual itself carries you into practice. Athletes have pre-game rituals. Writers have their morning routines. Artists have their studio habits. These aren't superstitions. They're psychological tools that manage transitions, focus attention, and create mental readiness. Build your own practice ritual. Keep it simple. Keep it consistent. Let it become automatic. And then let it carry you into focused practice day after day, without requiring constant decisions or motivational speeches to yourself. The ritual handles the starting. You handle the practicing. And here's something about how you frame your goals. Learning improves when goals are framed as challenges. There's a difference between I have to practice and I'm going to see if I can do this challenging thing. The first is obligation. The second is challenge. Obligation drains energy. Challenge focuses it. When you frame practice as a challenge to overcome, as a puzzle to solve, as a test to meet, you're engaging a different motivational system. You're activating curiosity, competitiveness with yourself, the satisfaction of rising to meet difficulty. This doesn't mean making everything a competition. It means framing your practice goals in ways that feel challenging rather than obligatory. Not, I need to complete this exercise, but I'm going to see if I can complete this exercise without any errors. The shift seems small, but psychologically it's significant. Challenges engage us. Obligations burden us. Frame your practice as challenge and watch how your engagement changes. Here's a sophisticated distinction that fast learners make. Fast learners separate exploration from exploitation. Exploration is when you're trying new things, testing different approaches, playing at the edges of what you know. Exploitation is when you're executing what you know works, refining it, getting better at it. Both are necessary, but they're different activities with different mindsets. Many learners mix them chaotically, sometimes exploring, sometimes exploiting, without deliberately choosing. But fast learners are conscious about which mode they're in. This session is exploration. I'm going to try variations and see what works. This session is exploitation. I'm going to execute the approach I've found works and refine it. This separation prevents the frustration that comes from expecting refinement during exploration, or the stagnation that comes from only exploiting and never exploring. Both modes are valuable, but they work best when you engage them deliberately, knowing which one you're in and what it's for. Here's something about realistic preparation. Learning improves when learners anticipate obstacles. Fast learners don't just plan for success, they plan for difficulty. Before starting a practice session or learning project, they ask, what might go wrong? What obstacles might I encounter? And they prepare for those obstacles in advance. Maybe they identify what they'll do if they get stuck. Maybe they schedule extra time for challenging sections. Maybe they prepare mental strategies for when frustration hits. This anticipation doesn't mean pessimism, it means realism. Obstacles will occur. Difficulty will arise. And if you've anticipated these, if you've planned your response, you're not derailed when they appear. You're ready. You execute your prepared response and continue. But learners who don't anticipate obstacles are surprised by them, thrown off by them. What feels like failure is just the normal friction of learning. Anticipate it, plan for it, and suddenly it loses its power to stop you. And here's a related practice. Skills improve faster when rehearsing failure recovery. Don't just practice succeeding. Practice recovering from errors. Deliberately make a mistake, then practice the correction. Practice what you'll do when things go wrong. This serves multiple purposes. It normalizes errors, making them less emotionally disruptive. It builds confidence in your ability to recover. It gives you actual practice procedures for getting back on track. And it reveals that most errors are recoverable, which reduces fear and increases willingness to take risks during practice. Athletes do this constantly. Practice falling and getting back up. Practice recovery from bad positions. You can apply this to any skill. What happens when you lose your place? Practice finding it again. What happens when you forget the next step? Practice the recovery. Rehearsing failure recovery transforms errors from catastrophes into minor bumps. And that transformation accelerates learning because you're no longer avoiding challenge to avoid errors. Here's something subtle but powerful. Fast learners optimize practice order. They don't just decide what to practice, they decide when to practice each thing. They might practice their weakest skill first, when they're freshest. Or they might start with something they do well to build confidence. They might alternate between related skills to create productive interference. They might save the most complex task for when they've warmed up. There's no single right order, but there is a right order for you, in your current state, with your current goals. Fast learners experiment with sequencing. They notice which orders produce better results. They adjust. This optimization might seem like a minor detail, but practice order affects cognitive load, motivation, the quality of each element. The same practice elements in a different sequence can produce noticeably different results. So pay attention to order, experiment, find sequences that work, and recognize that the optimal order might change as you develop, so continue adjusting. Finally, let's revisit something we've touched on before from a new angle. Learning improves when context is varied. We discussed varying practice itself, but there's also value in varying the context, the environment, the time of day, the equipment, the social setting. When you always practice in exactly the same context, your learning becomes bound to that context. You perform well there but struggle when anything changes. But when you deliberately practice in varied contexts, you're teaching your brain to extract what's essential across all contexts. You're building flexible, portable skill rather than context-dependent performance. So practice at different times, in different locations, with different tools when possible. This variation requires adaptation, which deepens learning, and it ensures that when you need to apply the skill in a new context, which you inevitably will, you're ready. The skill isn't bound to one environment, it's truly yours, accessible wherever you need it. Fast learning is a self-correcting loop. Track visually to see what's happening. Control difficulty to stay in the learning zone. Seek informational rewards that guide improvement. Build rituals that reduce starting friction. Frame goals as challenges that engage you. Separate exploration from exploitation deliberately. Anticipate obstacles and rehearse recovery. Optimize the order of practice. Vary the context to build flexibility. This is not passive learning. This is active, intelligent, adaptive learning. You're not just executing a practice plan. You're monitoring, adjusting, optimizing. You're being both the student and the coach, both the practitioner and the observer. And that dual awareness, that ability to practice while simultaneously observing your practice, that's what creates the self-correcting loop that accelerates learning beyond what simple repetition could ever achieve. Rest now. Your brain is building these feedback loops even as you sleep, creating systems of self-monitoring and self-correction. Tomorrow, you'll practice differently, more aware, more adaptive, more effective. The loop is already beginning. Sometimes in learning, progress seems to slow down. The early excitement fades, improvement feels smaller, and it can seem as though something inside you has reached its limit. But learning plateaus are rarely a sign that ability has run out. Much more often, they are signals that a strategy has stopped working. The mind adapts quickly to repeated patterns, and when growth stalls, it is usually inviting a small change, a new approach, a different angle. Seen this way, a plateau is not a failure. It is quiet feedback, patiently waiting to be noticed. One of the gentlest ways to move past these plateaus is through reflection. Repeating the same action again and again can feel productive, but reflection gives learning its depth. Pausing to think about what worked, what didn't, and why something felt difficult allows the brain to organize experience into understanding. Even a brief moment of reflection can do more than hours of mindless repetition. It's during these calm pauses that lessons settle, making space for progress to return naturally. Interestingly, many fast learners do something that looks counterintuitive at first. They slow down, especially in the beginning. By moving deliberately and without rush, they give the brain time to notice details, patterns, and subtle feedback. Slowness reduces unnecessary errors and builds a clean foundation. Speed, when it comes later, grows from this clarity. Like learning a melody slowly before letting it flow, patience early on creates ease later. As skills develop, continuing to practice beyond initial competence becomes valuable. This is known as overlearning, and it quietly improves both speed and reliability. When a skill is practiced until it feels effortless, it becomes less fragile. Under pressure or fatigue, it remains available. Overlearning doesn't mean forcing more effort. It simply means allowing repetition to settle deeply until action feels calm and natural. Another subtle shift that improves learning is where attention is placed. Instead of focusing inward on every movement or thought, learning often improves when attention is directed outward, toward the result, toward the effect of an action. This external focus allows the body and mind to coordinate more smoothly without over-control. It creates a sense of flow where effort softens and performance becomes more fluid. Learning also grows stronger when goals carry meaning. When a skill connects to something personal, useful, or valued, the brain pays closer attention. Meaning doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be as simple as curiosity, usefulness, or quiet satisfaction. Meaning acts like a gentle anchor, helping learning feel less like effort and more like purpose. Errors, too, play an important role when they are understood correctly. Learning accelerates when mistakes provide information rather than judgment. An error is simply a signal, showing what to adjust next. When mistakes are seen as messages instead of failures, the brain updates more efficiently. There is less tension, less resistance, and more openness to improvement. Over time, successful learners tend to rely less on bursts of motivation and more on systems. Motivation comes and goes, but systems remain steady. A system might be a routine, a habit, or a simple structure that makes learning easier to begin. When systems are in place, progress continues even on days when energy feels low. Learning becomes something you return to naturally, without effortful persuasion. Closely connected to this is the idea of environment. Fast learners shape their surroundings to support success. They reduce friction, remove distractions, and make practice easy to start. An environment that supports learning gently guides behavior without force. In these spaces, effort feels lighter and consistency becomes almost automatic. All of these ideas come together in a simple truth. Learning fast is not about talent. It is about alignment. Alignment between how the brain learns, how practice is structured, and how life supports the process. When strategies match the mind's natural rhythms, learning becomes calm, steady, and surprisingly efficient. There is no rush here, only quiet progress unfolding at its own peaceful pace.